A pale mist clung to the Virginia hills that morning, rolling like ghostly waves through the trees. The road was empty, save for one man. His boots pressed into the damp earth, each step heavy with miles of silence. His name was Elias, a carpenter by trade, and a drifter by consequence. He carried little more than a weathered toolbox, the wood darkened by years of calloused hands, and eyes that carried the burden of things he wished he'd never seen. He'd walked through towns that forgot their own names, slept beneath barns that creaked with the weight of memories. But today, as the fog lifted, he saw the valley ahead, a stretch of land that looked both alive and abandoned. Somewhere within it waited the mansion that would change everything. Elias paused on the ridge, adjusting the strap of his coat, and stared down at the silhouette rising from the earth like a wound that refused to close. The old Hargrove mansion stood alone in the distance, framed by crooked oaks and a stillness that felt unnatural. Its chimneys leaned, its roof sagged, yet it refused to die. The closer Elias came, the heavier the air grew, thick with the scent of wet timber and something else. Something like regret. The front gates, twisted and half-hinged, squealed open at his touch. The gravel path that led to the entrance was littered with dead leaves and feathers, as though the land itself was shedding what it could no longer bear. The mansion loomed before him, its columns cracked, its windows shrouded in dust. Through the misted glass he could see fragments of faded grandeur, chandeliers dim with cobwebs, portraits draped in gray sheets, a piano slumped in the corner of the grand hall. This house had once hosted laughter, music, and firelight, but now it seemed to mourn its own past. Elias felt it before he understood it, the strange awareness that some places remember, even when people forget. He was about to turn away when the sound of footsteps echoed from within, slow, deliberate, unhurried, each one carried the weight of ownership. A tall man emerged from the shadowed doorway, his coat pressed, his hair silver though not yet old. His eyes, however, looked centuries deep. "You must be the carpenter," the man said. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone used to being obeyed. Elias nodded once. "Elias, you sent for repairs." The man studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "I am Mr. Hargrove," he replied. "This house was built by my great-grandfather. It stood longer than most men in this valley. But time," he glanced at the decaying beams above, "time is no friend to wood." Inside, the mansion breathed in whispers. Every step Elias took released a soft groan from the floorboards, as if the house resented his intrusion. Dust floated through slants of sunlight, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and candle wax. Along the corridor, portraits lined the walls, faces of proud men and solemn women, their painted eyes following him. Hargrove's voice broke the silence. "You'll find the structure sound enough, but there are certain areas best left untouched." Elias turned slightly. "Such as?" "The east wing," Hargrove said after a pause. "It was sealed after an accident. There's no need to disturb it." Their eyes met for a brief, silent beat. Elias didn't ask what kind of accident. He'd seen enough houses and enough men to know that walls often hid what tongues refused to tell. Hargrove extended a hand, the gesture both polite and commanding. "Repair what time has broken, Mr. Elias," he said quietly. "Nothing more." Elias took the hand, feeling the cold strength beneath it. In that single touch, he sensed both desperation and control, an unspoken warning. Outside, the wind began to rise again, sweeping through the dying oaks. The mansion eked in answer, like an old body shifting in its grave. Elias looked once more at the crumbling banisters, the cracked ceiling, the shadows that stretched too far across the floor. He didn't yet know it, but each nail he would loosen from that house would unearth something the earth itself had tried to forget. That night, the mansion spoke. Not in words, but in slow, aching sounds, the kind that creep beneath your skin and keep your heart half awake. Elias lay on a narrow cot in the old servant quarters, a small room that smelled of mildew and coal dust. The walls were thin, the plaster cracked in long, twisting veins. Outside, wind moaned through the shutters, rattling them in uneven rhythms. He tried to sleep, but the quiet wouldn't let him. The silence in that place wasn't empty. It felt crowded, as though it held its breath. Then, sometime past midnight, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured, as though someone was pacing directly above him. He sat up, every sense alert. The boards above groaned under the weight of something, or someone moving. One step, then another, The sound traveled from one corner of the ceiling to the next, circling, then stopping right above his bed. Elias waited, the candlelight flickering beside him, throwing uneasy shadows on the wall. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. Silence returned. Heavy, waiting, almost aware. Elias lay back down, eyes open, the soft thud of his heartbeat echoing in the hollow room. The house was breathing, watching, listening. He didn't know it yet, but it had been waiting for him longer than he could imagine. Morning brought no comfort. The air was cold, thick with the scent of old varnish and rot. Elias climbed the central staircase, his boots thudding softly against the worn steps. Each creak seemed to answer back like a whisper. He found himself in a long corridor known as the Hall of Portraits. Sunlight pushed through dusty curtains, casting pale stripes across 100 painted faces. The Hargrove lineage stared down from their frames, men in military coats, women in lace and pearls, children frozen in brushstrokes of innocence. Their eyes, though painted, seemed strangely alive. Wherever Elias moved, their gaze followed. He stopped before one portrait, a young boy with golden hair and a blue ribbon tied neatly around his collar. The artist had painted him with a small wooden toy in his hand, a bird carved delicately from oak. Something about the expression unsettled Elias. The smile was faint, too faint. Behind him a voice spoke. He was the last of the Hargrove heirs. Elias turned. It was Miss Agnes, the housekeeper. Her gray hair was pulled tightly beneath a bonnet, her eyes sharp, though tired. "Died young," she added softly, brushing a speck of dust from the frame. "The family doesn't like to speak of him." Elias studied her for a moment. "And yet they keep him here," he said. She gave a thin smile. Some memories refused to leave, even when asked. Then she turned to go, her keys jangling faintly. As she disappeared down the corridor, Elias caught a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. The boy's painted hand, the one holding the toy bird, seemed to shift ever so slightly toward him. He blinked, and it was still again. Shaking off the chill, Elias continued his inspection, marking beams and worn panels that needed repair. When he reached the upper landing, he noticed a heavy oak door at the far end of the hall. Its brass handle was tarnished, the keyhole dark and sealed with rust. The door felt wrong. Even from a distance, it carried an air of something locked for reasons that had nothing to do with safety. Elias reached for the handle, but before his hand touched it, Miss Agnes's voice cut sharply through the corridor. "Not that one." He turned, startled. She stood at the foot of the stairs, her expression pale, her voice low but firm. "That door hasn't been opened in years. You'll leave it be." Elias hesitated. "Ed, what's behind it?" She lowered her eyes. "The east wing was sealed after the accident. The master wants it untouched." Elias nodded slowly, withdrawing his hand. Yet, as he descended the stairs, the silence behind him seemed to pulse, as though the mansion itself had drawn a breath of relief. That night, as he passed the upper hall once more, the faintest sound came from the other side of the forbidden door, a soft scrape, like wood against wood. Elias paused, candle trembling in his hand. He leaned closer, listening. The sound stopped. Then came a single, almost inaudible whisper, too faint to be words but enough to make his skin crawl. Something behind that door was waiting. Morning light spilled through the high windows, hazy and pale, painting the air with floating dust. Elias stood in the grand hall, sleeves rolled, hands steady around a block of sandpaper. The walls were layered thick with paint, years of it, built up like rings on an ancient tree. He worked slowly, smoothing one panel at a time, the rhythm of his strokes steady and precise. The air smelled of old oak and turpentine, sharp and earthy. Then his hand paused. Beneath the top coat, faint lines began to appear. Not brush marks, not cracks. Carvings. Elias leaned closer, scraping carefully with the edge of a blade. More shapes emerged, small, uneven letters etched into the wood long before the last paint was laid. They were childish in form, shallow, trembling as if made by a small, frightened hand. He brushed away the dust and read what he could. "Don't let him in." A cold silence filled the room. Elias stepped back, staring at the message half buried beneath decades of paint. There were others too, symbols, initials, a rough drawing of a bird inside a cage. His breath caught in his throat. Someone, some child, had written warnings into the very bones of the house. The wind pushed gently against the tall windows, and the wall seemed to sigh. Elias felt for the first time that the wood was alive. It didn't merely hold memories, it remembered them. He set down his tools and pressed his palm against the wall. The surface was cool, but he swore he could feel a faint heartbeat beneath it. Slow, distant, patient. The rest of the day, he worked in uneasy silence. Every swing of his hammer echoed too loudly. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper beneath his feet. As he crossed from the hall into the corridor, a long groan rose through the planks, bending and stretching like a sigh escaping from the walls themselves. At first he ignored it. Old wood always complained, but then it changed. The sound grew rhythmic, soft, almost deliberate. It seemed to call a name, low and muffled. Elias froze, breath held. He waited, listening. The board spoke again, longer this time, the sound vibrating through the soles of his boots. Eli. As he staggered back, eyes wide. No voice had spoken, no wind had passed, yet the sound was unmistakable. His name, whispered through the boards. Elias dropped to one knee, pressing his ear to the floor. Beneath the oak panels, something moved, something faint, like a shifting breath trapped within the timbers. The house was speaking to him, and though its words were broken, its meaning was clear. It knew him. He rose slowly, every sense alert. The air had thickened, heavy as smoke, though no fire burned. In the stillness, he could almost hear laughter, a child's laughter, echoing faintly down the empty hall. The sun was low when he finally returned to his work. He tried to convince himself fatigue was playing tricks on him, that the voice had been the groan of settling beams. But then, as he replaced a warped plank near the baseboard, his chisel struck something hard. It rang metallic. Elias frowned and knelt closer. There, among a neat line of blackened nails, one gleamed brighter than the rest. It was newer, too new. He tapped it with the end of his hammer. It didn't sink. It resisted, anchored into something beneath. Curiosity prickled through him. He pried at it gently, the edge of his tool wedging under the head. The wood groaned in protest as if the house itself objected. With a final twist, the nail came loose, and a small puff of dust escaped the crack, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of iron and something else. Something foul. He leaned closer. Behind the loosened board, a narrow gap opened, dark, hollow, cold. The draft that spilled from it felt ancient, untouched by air for decades. Elias peered into the opening but could see nothing, only blackness. Still, a shiver crawled up his spine. Someone had placed that nail there not to build, but to seal. He set the nail on the floor beside him. The metal was oddly warm in his palm, pulsing faintly, as though remembering the hand that had driven it in. As twilight deepened and the house settled into its nightly groans, Elias could not shake the feeling that every wall, every beam, and every nail in that place had a story. And none of them wanted to stay buried. The night had grown thick with silence, save for the rhythmic chirp of crickets beyond the shuttered windows. Elias walked the grand staircase, candle in hand, checking the carpentry repairs he'd made that afternoon. The air smelled faintly of linseed oil and damp plaster, but as he reached the halfway landing, the flame flickered, not from wind, but as if the air itself recoiled. There by the railing stood a figure. A woman, pale, almost transparent, her dress trailing like a whisper. The light quivered across her outline, revealing hair that shimmered with the dust of years. She turned slowly, not walking, but gliding, her face turned toward him with eyes that seemed heavy with grief. Elias froze. The wood beneath his boots moaned, and the flame wavered again. He blinked, and she was gone. Only the faint scent of lavender remained, the kind used in old wardrobes to keep moths away. When he looked again, the shadow seemed deeper, more deliberate. He whispered to himself, maybe it's just the light. Yet, when he touched the rail she had leaned upon, it was warm, as though someone had been standing there moments ago. And from upstairs, a soft thud answered, like a door closing itself. The next morning, Elias approached Miss Agnes, the housekeeper, a thin woman with a posture as rigid as a broom handle and eyes that never fully blinked. She was polishing the silver in the dining hall when he asked, trying to sound casual, "Has anyone else been walking the staircase after dark?" She stopped mid-polish, the cloth tightening in her hand. "You saw her, didn't you?" she said quietly, almost to herself. Elias frowned. Saw who? Miss Agnes crossed herself. The lady. She doesn't rest easy. She's still waiting upstairs. Her voice trembled slightly, then firmed again. Don't go wandering at night, Mr. Elias, and whatever you do, keep away from the East Wing. The East Wing? He asked. What's there? Her gaze shifted toward the hallway as if afraid it might be listening. A room that was locked long before you came. Mr. Hargrove forbade us from touching it. He says it's storage, but I know better. Elias noticed her hands trembling. Better for you to fix what's broken downstairs, she muttered. Some things up there don't want mending. He tried to laugh it off, but her tone left a chill in him colder than any draft the mansion could produce. Later that evening, while adjusting the frame of an old portrait above the staircase, Elias felt the strange urge to look closer. The painting depicted a woman in a flowing white gown, her gaze distant yet alive. The same lavender hue, the same soft sorrow, as the figure he'd seen in the candlelight. He leaned in. The oil paint had cracked with age, but beneath the flaking brush strokes, he noticed something peculiar, faint, deliberate scratches along the wooden frame, not random wear, but a pattern. Letters, numbers. He rubbed the dust away and whispered, 372. It looked like part of a cipher carved by hand and covered again in gold leaf. He glanced over his shoulder, feeling the familiar creak of the boards echo in the hall. Then, as the candle flame licked the edge of the frame, the painted woman's eyes seemed to shimmer, just for a moment, like wet glass. Elias stumbled back. The floorboards under the portrait groaned, and a fine trail of plaster dust fell from above, as if something inside the wall had shifted. When he looked again, he noticed something he hadn't before. In the reflection of the glass, behind his own image, stood her, watching. And the whisper returned. She's still waiting upstairs. Days passed, and Elias began to sense that the house itself resisted his repairs. Every board he fixed seemed to groan in protest. Every nail he hammered sank into the wood with an unnatural reluctance. One afternoon, as he worked along the parlor wall, he noticed something peculiar. The nails along the paneling weren't aligned like the rest. They were older, darker, driven in at odd angles, as though someone had wanted to conceal rather than secure. He leaned closer. Each nail head was slightly flattened, smoothed over by deliberate pressure, and painted to blend into the wood. It was the kind of trick a builder might use not to repair a wall, but to bury a secret within it. Elias's carpenter's intuition stirred uneasily. This wasn't done to hold, he murmured. It was done to hide. He ran his hand across the surface, feeling subtle dips beneath the paint. Someone had replaced an entire section of paneling, too carefully, too quietly. And whoever had done it had made sure no one would notice unless they were looking for it. He fetched his chisel, but his hand hesitated. The memory of Miss Agnes's warning echoed in his mind. Some things up there don't want mending. Still, the carpenter in him couldn't resist. Secrets built into wood deserved to be uncovered. That evening, when the house had quieted and the servants had retired, Elias lit a single lantern and returned to the parlor. The flame cast long, trembling shadows across the wall. He wedged the chisel beneath one of the strange nails and gave a soft tap. The metal gave way with a faint squeal. Another nail followed, then another. The wood moaned as if exhaling after years of holding its breath. When he pried the panel loose, a dark streak caught his eye, a rusty discoloration running beneath the nail holes. At first he thought it was just water damage, but as he rubbed it with his thumb, the truth became clear. It wasn't rust. It was blood. The dried crimson had seeped into the grain of the wood itself, forming faint smears and hand-shaped traces. Elias felt a cold wave crawl up his spine. "Good God," he whispered. He dropped the nail, and it clattered on the floor, echoing in the vast silence of the hall. Somewhere above him, the boards groaned again, that same low, answering sound the mansion made whenever he uncovered something it wanted buried. His lantern flickered. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the reflection of the brass fittings, the faint silhouette of a hand pressed from the inside of the wall. Elias's curiosity overpowered his fear. He set the lantern on the floor and pressed his ear to the exposed wall. Beneath the timber, the sound wasn't solid. It was hollow, like an empty chest. He tapped lightly, and the echo came back soft and resonant. Something was hidden there. He widened the opening, removing more nails, more panels. Dust spilled out, thick and gray, as if time itself were leaking through. Finally, behind the last plank, he saw it, a small sealed cavity no larger than a coffin. The edges were reinforced not by a builder's hand, but by someone desperate to keep it closed. He reached in cautiously with the chisel. Inside he felt only fragments. A strip of rotted fabric, something like lace, and what seemed to be the brittle edge of a photograph or frame. The air inside the cavity was stale, tinged with iron. Then came the faintest sound, a sigh, low and drawn, rising from within the walls themselves. The lantern dimmed for a heartbeat as though the air had thickened. Elias stumbled backward, heart pounding. The cavity before him gaped like an open wound in the mansion's body, and from upstairs, beyond the locked east wing, a door creaked open. The sound lingered, patient, deliberate, as though something had just been freed. The dining hall of the Hargrove mansion glowed with a flickering amber light that softened none of its decay. Long tapestries hung limp, their colors faded, and a great portrait of the Hargrove patriarch loomed over the table, his painted eyes following each movement. Mr. Hargrove sat at the head, shoulders rigid, a glass of sherry trembling in his grasp. Across from him Elias ate quietly, his fork scraping the porcelain in rhythmic unease. The air carried the scent of roasted meat, but beneath it lingered something older, dampness, wood rot, and secrets too long sealed. "You must forgive the state of the house," Hargrove muttered, attempting a smile. "It's been difficult to keep things as they were. My ancestors built this place with pride, and a touch of vanity." He gestured toward the portraits lining the walls. Each Hargrove believed himself the last great man of the name. His voice wavered on the last word. Elias studied him. The man's cuff trembled as he raised his glass again. His gaze darted toward the east wing, the locked corridor, before snapping back to the table. The silence that followed was thick and uneven, like a floorboard ready to break. Somewhere in the rafters a soft thud echoed. Mr. Hargrove pretended not to hear it. Later that night, Elias found Miss Agnes in the kitchen, her wrinkled hands folding linens by lantern light. He asked quietly, "What did Mr. Hargrove mean about the family line ending?" The old woman's fingers froze. Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as though afraid the house itself might listen. "There was a boy," she said softly. "Years ago. The last heir, little Thomas Hargrove. He was 6 when he disappeared." "Disappeared?" Elias asked. "Vanished without a trace. They said he wandered into the woods, but those of us who worked here knew better." The fire crackled sharply. Agnes lowered her voice. "He used to play by the east wing. His laughter filled those halls, until one night it stopped. The next morning his room was empty, and the master ordered it locked forever." Elias felt the weight of her words settle into him like cold rain. The east wing, the sealed panels, the blood beneath the nails. Agnes leaned closer, her whisper barely audible. "They never buried a child, Mr. Elias. And no one ever saw the coffin leave this house." The next evening's meal unfolded under a strange, heavy quiet. Only 3 places were set at the table: Mr. Hargrove's, Elias's, and an empty one at the far end, dust gathering on its plate. The candles hissed and wept wax down their sides. The storm outside beat faintly against the windows, but within the room the greater storm was silence. Mr. Hargrove spoke little, save for murmured remarks about the foundation's rot, the age of the wood, topics that meant nothing but filled the void. His eyes never quite met Elias's. At one point Elias caught the master staring toward the empty chair. His lips moved faintly, as if he were answering someone unseen. "Is someone joining us?" Elias ventured carefully. Hargrove blinked, startled, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Old habits," and he said weakly. "Some chairs are never meant to be empty." Lightning flashed, casting the portraits into sharp relief. For an instant, the painted eyes of young Thomas Hargrove, the missing heir, seemed to glimmer, alive under the light. Elias looked away, heart pounding. When he looked back, the reflection in the silver dish showed something impossible. The faint outline of a small hand resting on the empty plate. And beside it, the faint impression of breath. The evening rain had turned into a soft, steady whisper against the windows as Elias pried away the last layer of rotted paneling. Dust spilled from the crevice like breath from a long-buried grave. Behind the boards, a faint draft exhaled, cold, damp, and old enough to carry the scent of forgotten things. His lantern trembled in his hand as the flame caught the edge of something strange, a narrow gap, no wider than his shoulders, leading into darkness beneath the mansion's floor. He crouched, brushed away the splinters, and pressed his palm against the cold timber. It moved, ever so slightly. The hidden passage groaned open. Inside, the air was thick and still, heavy with the musk of decayed wood and old secrets. Elias ducked beneath a beam and crawled forward, the light dancing along the walls. The tunnel was crudely made, built not by craftsmen but by hands desperate to conceal. Every board whispered when his weight pressed upon it. He noticed claw-like marks along the planks. Thin scratches, made not by tools but by fingers. Small fingers. The deeper he went, the colder it became, until his breath fogged in front of him. And then, his lantern revealed a space that opened wider. A hidden chamber. In the center, beneath layers of cobwebs and debris, sat a chest. A rusted, iron-bound chest wrapped in faded red ribbons. Elias knelt before the chest, his pulse drumming in his throat. The ribbons were brittle, their color nearly gone, but their pattern was delicate, the sort of care given to a child's gift, not a burial. The lock, eaten by rust, looked untouched for decades. He brushed off the dust and ran his hand over the lid. Someone had carved initials there, T.H., the same letters he'd seen in the family portraits upstairs. He tried the lock. It resisted. When he pressed again, the metal groaned and a shower of rust fell onto his boots. The chest shuddered open with a sigh that seemed to echo through the chamber. Inside, the contents lay undisturbed, arranged with an eerie, deliberate tenderness. A small, leather-bound shoe, worn smooth at the heel. A folded letter, yellowed and sealed with wax that had long since cracked. And beside them, resting on a cushion of dust, a small wooden carving of a dove. The lantern light flickered across the carving's surface, revealing the initials again. T.H., etched in a shaky, childish hand. Elias lifted it carefully, the wood warm despite the chill. The shoe was no larger than his palm. It belonged to a child no older than 6. Elias hesitated before unfolding the letter. The paper tore at the edges, as if even it resisted being read. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, the ink faded and smudged. "Forgive me. I could not let them take him. The truth is buried where the nails do not hold, where the boards remember." No name followed, only the faint outline of a tear stain that had never dried. Elias exhaled slowly, his mind reeling. "The truth is buried," he whispered. His lantern flickered again. From somewhere behind him, deep within the narrow passage, a sound broke the silence, the faint tap of wood against wood. He turned, the light trembling, once, twice, then again. It was rhythmic, intentional, as though someone, or something, was knocking from inside the walls. He stared into the darkness, heart pounding, the letter shaking out in his hands. And for the briefest moment he thought he saw movement, a small shadow retreating into the dark shaped like a child. The flame sputtered, then steadied. The chamber was still. Only the chest remained open, its contents waiting, its secret no longer buried but far from revealed. The candlelight trembled as Elias unfolded the letter again, his fingers brushing the fragile edges. The words, though faded, carried a pulse, each line beating with sorrow. The handwriting was graceful, belonging to someone educated, refined, a woman of standing. "To whoever finds this, forgive me, I am not the woman they believe me to be." The ink bled where tears had once fallen. "The child upstairs. He bears not the name of Hargrove, though he should have. He is mine, and his father's sin." Elias paused, the air around him heavy with the ghost of confession. He read on. "They said love could not cross the walls of class, that a servant's touch could not be pure. But he was kind. He carved the wood that built this house, his hands rough but his heart honest. I loved him. God forgive me, I loved him." The words cut through him like nails through timber. The lady of the house, and a carpenter. When the boy was born, the master swore it would destroy us all. So I swore him to silence. He built walls not to keep us safe, but to hide the child born of shame. The final line trembled in his vision. He sealed his own child beneath the wood he built. Elias lowered the letter, breath uneven. Somewhere above, the storm groaned through the rafters like the mansion itself remembered every word. He stared at the small shoe beside the letter, the child's shoe small enough to fit in his palm. The truth weighed heavier now, like a beam ready to splinter. The boy. Thomas Hargrove. But not truly a Hargrove at all. The missing heir was the child of a forbidden love, a woman of privilege, and a man who worked with his hands. Elias closed his eyes, the echoes of the woman's guilt threading through the silence. She hadn't written this for forgiveness. She'd written it as a monument to her sin, a secret to outlive them all. The Hargroves had covered the scandal by sealing the truth inside their own home. The boy was hidden, not taken by the woods, not lost to the night, but entombed beneath the house that bore his father's craftsmanship. Elias traced the carving of the dove again, realizing what it symbolized: peace, purity, innocence. The child's final token. And then another thought struck him like a hammer. The man who built these walls, the carpenter she loved, must have been forced to bury his own son. Elias felt the air leave his chest. The story wasn't about one sin. It was about a chain of them, nailed shut and hidden behind the wood. Every nail he had found out of place, every creak in the floorboards, every whisper in the walls. It wasn't time that had broken this house. It was guilt. Elias stood, lantern raised, scanning the chamber's walls. The grain of the wood seemed to ripple under the light, alive, breathing, remembering. He placed his hand on one of the beams and felt something strange, the faint pulse of warmth, as if the house itself were listening. He whispered, "You built this to hide him, didn't you?" The boards groaned softly in reply. His eyes darted to the seams where panels met. Each joint was deliberate, each nail placed not for strength but for silence. It wasn't random. It was design. The mansion itself had been constructed as a coffin. Every corridor, every false wall, every hidden chamber. It was a body of secrets, breathing under the weight of its own lies. Elias stepped back, heart pounding. He could almost see it now. The ghost of the first carpenter hammering through tears, sealing the boards that would silence his son forever. And suddenly, Elias understood why he had come here. Not to repair what time had broken, but to uncover what guilt had been. Wilt. The night descended upon Virginia with a fury that felt almost divine. The wind howled through the hills like a warning, long, mournful, and cold. The Hargrove mansion stood silhouetted against the storm, its windows flickering like dying eyes, its timbers groaning under the weight of the tempest. Elias fastened the shutters in the servant quarters, but the wind tore through the cracks, slicing through him with damp chill. Each clap of thunder rolled through the valley, shaking the beams that had stood for a century. The old house moaned with every gust, the way a wounded animal might cry out in pain. Rain lashed the roof in torrents, and lightning flashed across the portrait hall, igniting the faded faces of ancestors in cold blue light. For a moment they seemed alive, watching, waiting. Elias set his lantern on the table, its flame quivering in the draught. Above him something shifted. A beam perhaps, or footsteps. He couldn't tell anymore where the house ended and the storm began. Outside, the oak trees bent low, their branches clawing at the windows. A loose shutter slammed open somewhere in the east wing, echoing like a gunshot. Elias felt it in his chest. The house was moving, breathing, remembering. He whispered under his breath, "Hold, old house, hold." But even he could hear the answer in the wood, a deep, splintering groan that promised the storm would take what guilt had built. The wind screamed through the cracks now, a chorus of hollow voices twisting through the corridors. Elias moved toward the hall, his lantern throwing long, trembling shadows across the walls. That's when he heard it, beneath the roar of thunder, faint at first, then clearer, a voice. It came from within the walls, soft as breath. Elias. He froze. The sound was neither echo nor dream. It was real, resonant, and close. Elias. Again Bie, but this time from another direction. Behind him, then above, then below. He turned in circles, heart pounding, every nerve alive. "Who's there?" he called. The wind seemed to hush for just a heartbeat, as though the mansion itself were listening. Then came a second voice, higher, trembling, like that of a child. "Help me." Elias staggered backward, nearly dropping the lantern. The flame flared, casting light across the warped walls. The boards trembled. "Help me." The words carried sorrow, not malice. But they came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the structure, through every nail and joint. He pressed his hand against the wall. It was warm, impossibly warm, pulsing like skin. The storm roared louder, and thunder cracked above, shaking plaster loose from the ceiling. The portraits tilted on their hooks, faces twisting in the flicker of lightning. Elias. He backed away slowly, the sound of his name following him down the corridor. The lantern flame stretched, guttered, and for a moment, he thought he saw small handprints forming in the dust along the wainscot. They were leading him toward the east wing. The forbidden corridor. When Elias reached the end of the hall, the house fell deathly still. Only the steady drum of rain filled the silence. He stood before the tall, locked door of the east wing, the one Mr. Hargrove had sworn him never to open. The brass handle was cold beneath his fingertips, slick with condensation. He could feel his pulse echoing in his wrist, matching the rhythmic creaks within the walls. Then, slowly, with a sound like an exhale, the lock clicked. The door shuddered once, twice, and swung open on its own. The lantern flame flared violently, casting light into the black beyond. A rush of cold air spilled out, carrying the faint scent of lilac and old earth. At the far end of the corridor, a figure stood, small, still, and pale. The child's silhouette was framed in the lightning's glow, and as Elias stepped closer, the boy turned his head. His eyes were hollow, his mouth unmoving. But the words came again, soft, clear, and final. "Help me find the truth." Elias climbed the creaking staircase, lantern trembling in his hand. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the scent of mildew and time. When he pushed open the attic door, a rush of stale air hit him. Heavy, unmoving, as if the room had been holding its breath for a century. Dust blanketed the floor like snow, yet beneath the thin gray film lay something impossible. Footprints, small ones, bare, delicate, and recent. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. He knelt and ran his calloused fingers over one print, feeling the faint warmth still left behind. The lantern's flame flickered, throwing the shadow of a child across the far wall. He turned sharply. Nothing. Only a trunk, a rocking horse, and a cracked doll with one glass eye staring back. The house groaned as wind scraped against the shutters. "Who's there?" Elias whispered. No answer came, only the sound of something soft brushing across the floorboards behind him. The light padded steps of someone unseen. In the corner stood a tall, dust-veiled mirror. Its frame was carved with vines and doves, the same emblem that had haunted Elias since the day he arrived. He wiped the surface with his sleeve and froze. A small figure stood beside him. A boy, pale, hollow-eyed, dressed in tattered linen. The child's head tilted, curious but sorrowful, his reflection clearer than Elias's own. Elias spun around. The attic was empty. When he looked back, the boy had stepped closer in the reflection, his hand reaching toward the glass. A faint crack split across the mirror like lightning. "Don't be afraid," Elias said, his voice unsteady. The boy's lips moved, but the sound was swallowed by the storm outside. The crack deepened, spreading into a web that distorted the child's face. Then, snap! The mirror fractured completely, shards spilling like raindrops across the wooden floor. Through the broken pieces, Elias could still see one reflection, the child's eyes, staring up at him, pleading. The attic dimmed. Only the lantern's dying flame remained, a soft glow trembling against the walls. Then, from the darkness, came a whisper. "Elias." The voice was small, breathless, but familiar. He turned, searching, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere. It drifted between the beams, under the rafters, through the very floor. You loosened the nails once before, the voice said again, more certain this time. Elias's heart pounded. Who are you? The reply came in a sigh that carried sorrow and accusation both. You built what they buried. The lantern flickered, and for an instant Elias saw the boy again. Not in the mirror this time, but standing in the corner, hand resting on the beam. His form shimmered, translucent, as the storm raged above. Then he was gone. Silence returned, save for the steady creak of wood shifting overhead. Elias looked at the beam, now cracked through the center, the same one he had reinforced days ago. A chill settled deep within him. He realized the ghost's warning was not about the past. The house was ready to fall again. The storm's echoes lingered in Elias's mind long after dawn broke, but as he sat beside the dying hearth, staring into the embers, another sound replaced the thunder, the clanging of hammers on iron bars. He was back in the prison workshop. The air reeked of sweat, sawdust, and despair. Men with hollow eyes planed rough wood into straight lines, their chains scraping with every motion. Elias had been one of them, a carpenter by trade, a convict by circumstance. They had forced him to build gallows and coffins during the war. Every nail driven into the planks had sounded like a heartbeat, dull and heavy with guilt. He had watched the nooses swing, the coffins sealed, each crafted by his own trembling hands. One officer, with a cruel smirk, had told him, "You build for the dead now, Carpenter. That's your penance." And so he did. For years Elias carved the wood of execution and burial, each creation a reminder of how the world could twist skill into sin. When the war ended, they released him with nothing but his tools. The world outside had moved on, but the ghosts of that workshop followed wherever he went. Years later, Elias found work again, rebuilding towns shattered by conflict. The men who hired him wore fine suits, not uniforms, but their demands carried the same cold weight. They never asked him to build homes, only to restore ruins. Crumbling estates, scorched churches, warehouses with floors that reeked faintly of blood. He soon realized these were not restorations but concealments. He remembered one mansion by the river, elegant, silent, and wrong. The basement had been sealed with bricks still red from fire. He asked the foreman what had happened there. The man had smiled thinly. "You build, you don't ask." Elias had signed the contract in silence. For months he rebuilt that estate, knowing it was a tomb for something unspeakable. Every board he set, every nail he drove, was part of a lie. When the final wall was sealed, his payment arrived in an unmarked envelope, thick with money, thin with conscience. He never returned to that place. Now, sitting in the Hargrove mansion, with its whispering walls and hidden chambers, Elias realized the pattern. He had been chosen again. To rebuild a lie, to bury the truth in polished wood. The dawn light spilled through the broken shutters, casting long bars of gold across the floorboards Elias had repaired himself. He stood, running his hand along the grain, tracing every nail, every line. This time, he told himself, the wood could speak for truth. He had come to the Hargrove estate for wages, but now it felt like something else. A reckoning. The ghosts he heard in the walls, the boy's reflection in the mirror, the cracked beam above his head, all of it was forcing him to remember, to confess through craft what words could not. He gathered his tools, the mallet, the chisel, the plane. Each held weight, not just of iron, but of memory. "If I build again," he whispered, "it'll be for peace." He began tearing down the boards that sealed the hidden passage, exposing the rot beneath. The air filled with dust, and beneath the wood lay the marks of old violence, stains, faint but real. Elias knelt. For the first time, he wasn't repairing. He was unbuilding. The mansion groaned, as if relieved. And for a fleeting moment, Elias thought he heard the boy's voice again. Softer now. Now it can breathe. The rain had stopped, but the mansion still shivered, as if the storm had taken root in its bones. Elias stood in the great hall, lantern flickering in his trembling hand. The walls around him were breathing, expanding, contracting, as if alive. He knew what he had to do. The last hidden nail glinted beneath a splintered panel, its head rusted, its purpose long fulfilled. Every other nail he had loosened had revealed lies. But this one, This one held the truth together. He knelt slowly, breath shallow. The wood was cold and wet beneath his fingers. He placed the claw of his hammer under the nail and hesitated. For a long moment the silence pressed in on him. Then, creak. The first sound was small, almost tender, like the sigh of something long confined, but it grew. The floorboards beneath his knees vibrated. A low moan spread through the mansion's frame, echoing from beam to beam. Elias stepped back, heart pounding. He looked up. The chandelier above him trembled. He had done it. The house was waking. As the nail came free, a single whisper escaped the wall, not of wind, but of me, Maury. And in that moment, the mansion began to breathe again. In pain. The first crack split across the ceiling like lightning frozen in plaster. Dust rained from above, coating Elias's face and hair in gray. He stumbled backward, lantern swinging wildly, casting fevered shadows over portraits whose painted eyes seemed to flinch in terror. The staircase groaned, not the polite creak of old wood, but the deep, grinding moan of something ancient tearing apart. Beams shifted, nails screamed. The chandelier snapped from its chain and crashed into the marble, shattering into 1,000 burning shards. Elias ran to the doorway, but the hall warped before him. The floor rising, the walls leaning inward as if the entire house exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. From upstairs came the echo of laughter, a child's laughter, faint but clear. Then the sob of a woman carried through the trembling air. The portraits on the walls rippled in their frames as if their subjects were trying to escape. He shouted over the chaos, voice lost to the roar of splitting timber. "It's over! It's all coming down!" But deep inside he knew the mansion wasn't dying. It was purging. Every beam that broke, every panel that fell, it wasn't collapse. It was confession. Elias stumbled toward the east wing, the place he'd been told never to go. The forbidden door now hung open, its hinges shrieking in surrender. Beyond it the corridor quaked like a living thing. He followed the sound, a hollow rattling behind the wall, rhythmic, desperate. He raised his lantern. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, revealing boards stained darker than age could explain. The wall buckled, then split apart. From the cavity within, something fell. Bones, small and fragile, tangled in the tatters of what once was silk. A locket clattered onto the floor beside them, its clasp still shut. Elias froze. The secret the mansion had guarded for generations had finally stepped into the light. The skeletons were not alone. More fell. 2 larger forms, their hands still clasped around each other. The family that had hidden their sin within their own walls now lay exposed, their silence undone by one carpenter's hand. The house groaned again, louder now like a wounded beast, plaster cracked, rafters twisted. Elias turned toward the door, but the path had vanished, swallowed by falling debris. He looked once more at the bones, whispered a prayer, and braced himself. The Hargrove mansion was coming down. The night sky split open with a scream of thunder, and lightning tore through the clouds, striking the Hargrove mansion square on its heart. The blast shook the valley, windows burst, and fire leapt like an unchained creature, devouring the old timbers in seconds. Elias was thrown to the ground, his lantern shattered beside him, its oil feeding the newborn inferno. The air turned thick, hot, and choking. Flames crawled up the drapes, licking the portraits that had watched too long in silence. He rose to his knees, coughing, eyes burning. The once grand hall was now a corridor of smoke and screaming wood. Above him the beams sagged like dying arms. The heat warped the very air, bending reality, blurring faces that weren't there. He stumbled forward, clutching his hammer, trying to remember where the door was. But the house had changed, its passages twisted, its stairs crumbling to ash beneath his boots. Somewhere deep within, the old piano began to play. One final melody, soft and sorrowful, its keys falling silent one by one as the flames consumed them. The Hargrove mansion, that proud monument to deceit and grief, was burning itself clean. Every lie, every secret, every ghost turned to smoke. Through the swirling smoke, Elias saw movement, a flicker of white gliding down the grand staircase untouched by flame. His pulse froze. The figure was small, barely the height of a child. Her hair shimmered silver in the firelight, her face pale and distant, eyes filled with something too deep for words. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, where the walls had begun to collapse inward. For a heartbeat, the storm's light cut through the windows, and Elias saw her clearly. the same child from the portraits, the heir who had vanished long ago. The ghost turned her head slowly and her lips moved, though the voice he heard was not from her mouth, but from the very walls around him. "Thank you," it whispered. Elias took a step closer, shielding his face from the heat. The air trembled as if time itself paused. Around them, flames burned without sound. The girl smiled faintly, then reached out, not to him, but toward the staircase above. From the shadows another figure emerged, the lady of the portrait, her gown flowing like mist, her eyes heavy with sorrow and release. Mother and child stood together one last time, then, as the roof split open and the stormlight poured in, they vanished, dissolving into the fire's golden haze. Elias turned as the ceiling gave way, the roar of falling timber deafening. The entire east wing collapsed behind him, throwing sparks into the storm. He sprinted down the main corridor, weaving between pillars as the mansion crumbled at his heels. He crashed through the front door, wood splintering, air rushing, and fell into the soaked grass outside. Rain drenched his face, steam rising from his coat where embers had kissed it. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the burning house. Its silhouette glowed red against the black hills, each flame tracing the edges of memory. The walls that had hidden so much now laid bare to the heavens. In his hand, something pressed into his palm. He opened it. The small wooden carving of a dove, scorched but unbroken. The same carving he had found in the hidden chamber. He held it to his chest, eyes closed, the rain mixing with tears he didn't know he still had. Behind him, the mansion groaned once more. A final, dying exhale. The great roof folded inward, and the fire swallowed what remained. The house of Hargrove was gone, but its ghosts, at last, were free. And Elias, the carpenter who had loosened the nails, walked away into the storm. By dawn the storm had passed, leaving the valley veiled in smoke and ruin. Where the Hargrove mansion once stood, only blackened stone and smoldering timber remained, but the town gathered quickly, drawn by rumor, outrage, and the scent of scandal. Elias stood amid the ashes, his clothes burned, hands blistered, eyes hollow. The sheriff's men encircled him like crows, rifles resting on their shoulders. "You burned it," one of them hissed. "That house stood for 100 years. It was already burning," Elias murmured. But the townsfolk saw only the wreckage, not the rot that had lived inside. To them, the mansion was heritage, the pride of Virginia's hills, not the tomb of the forgotten. They dragged him to the courthouse where the smell of char still clung to his coat. The judge, an old man with ties to the Hargrove name, stared down from the bench. "You claim innocence," the judge said, "but the fire says otherwise." Elias raised his eyes, calm but weary. "Sometimes," he replied. "Fire is the only truth left to tell." The courtroom erupted in whispers, half pity, half fury, but none there could guess what truths the flames had uncovered, or what horrors had slept behind the mansion's walls. Days later, when the embers cooled, townsmen sifted through the ruins and found more than ashes. From beneath the collapsed beams came boxes charred but intact, letters, ledgers, and documents sealed in wax. Among them, the sheriff discovered a bundle wrapped in scorched silk, the letter of confession Elias had found, along with the child's wooden carving. It spread through town like wildfire. The Hargrove legacy, once hailed as noble, was revealed to be built on betrayal and death. The missing heir, hidden to conceal a forbidden union. The servants who vanished without record. The walls that whispered because they had been built around bones. When the judge read the letter in court, the room fell silent. Mr. Hargrove's lineage, the wealth, the grandeur, was now tainted with the blood of those buried beneath his own floors. No one looked at Elias the same way again. Some with shame, some with awe, some with quiet fear. The carpenter had not destroyed history. He had exhumed it. Elias stood before the court one last time. The weight of every whisper, every secret seemed to rest on his shoulders. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the memory of the hammer. The same tool he had used to both build and undo. "I was hired to mend what time had broken," he began, his voice low but steady. "But what I found was rot disguised as legacy. He paused, glancing toward the courtroom window. Outside, the valley glowed with morning light, soft, forgiving. For years, he continued, I built walls for men who wanted to hide their sins. I covered graves with timber and nails, pretending it was work. But this time, I chose to uncover. The room was silent. Even the judge's pen stopped scratching. Elias looked down at the carving of the dove, still blackened from the fire, resting in his palm. Every nail I pulled, he said, wasn't to destroy. It was to set something free. When he finished, no one spoke. The gavel struck once, sharp as a coffin's lid. Elias was absolved of crime, but the weight of what he'd uncovered would follow him long after the ashes cooled. Years passed. The fire became legend, and the name Elias of Virginia was spoken in hushed tones. Part sinner, part savior. The valley healed slowly. Grass grew. Where the mansion once stood, and ivy crept over the stones that had survived the blaze. Elias returned one autumn evening, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. His beard was gray now, his hands still calloused, though time had softened their tremor. The ruin stood quiet, swallowed by nature. The grand staircase lay in fragments, and the great oak doors had long since rotted away. He walked through the site where the great hall had been. The light slanted through the trees, and for a moment the shadows looked like old memories. Servants moving, curtains swaying, a child laughing down the corridor. Then, as quickly as it came, the vision dissolved into silence. Kneeling beside the cracked foundation, Elias brushed away moss and ash. Beneath it, faintly etched into the stone, was the carving of a dove, the same one that had survived the fire, the same that now hung around his neck. He whispered, "I'm sorry it took so long," and set his toolbox gently on the ground. Elias worked quietly as dusk fell, cutting a small wooden cross from the remnants of fallen beams. His hammer, the same one he had carried since the war, lay beside him, rusted but true. Each strike of the chisel echoed softly through the valley, blending with the song of crickets and the rustle of wind through leaves. When the cross was finished, he stood it upright at the heart of the ruins. Around him the earth was still scorched, though patches of wildflowers had begun to bloom between the stones. He reached into his pocket and withdrew one final nail, the last from his old pouch. Its head was tarnished, its edge dulled by years of work. "This one's not to build," he murmured, "and not to hide." He set the nail against the wood and lifted his hammer. The sound rang out clean and solemn, a sound of ending, or perhaps of release. The echo drifted across the valley, fading into the evening air like a prayer for all that had been buried, all that had been revealed, and all that could finally rest. Night fell softly over the valley, the sky turning violet and silver. The ruins seemed at peace, the air no longer thick with sorrow or secrets, but calm, almost sacred. Elias sat by the cross, lantern flickering low, the light painting gentle halos over the stone. Then from the breeze came a familiar sound, faint, delicate, like the echo of a child's laugh. He looked up, heart still. The wind passed through the ivy, making it shimmer in the moonlight. "Rest now," he whispered. And in that stillness, he felt it. The weight lift from the land, from his soul. The whisper that had haunted him for years, the voice of guilt, of history, of the house itself, faded into silence. The wood no longer groaned, the air no longer carried names. Only the quiet hum of the night remained. Elias rose slowly, leaving his tools behind. He turned toward the hills, the cross standing firm behind him, the dove pendant catching one last glint of moonlight. As he walked into the darkness, the valley exhaled. The ghosts were gone, the story had ended, and with the final nail driven, the past, at last, was at peace.